Okay, with that, tonight we have an excellent speaker talking about the monarch butterfly. Katie Boyer is our speaker. She's a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who works on recovery of threatened, endangered, and at-risk species. She has been focused on the monarch butterfly conservation since 2015. She works with a wide variety of partners to implement conservation actions that will benefit the monarch and other pollinators. Katie also works on recovery planning and implementation for a variety of other migratory species. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in resource conservation from the University of Montana, so she should really be welcoming of last week, and a Master of Natural Resources Environmental from Utah. So Katie, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. Let me share my screen here. All right, can you see my screen and see me and hear me just fine?
It's looking great, Katie.
Excellent. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I don't know how I feel about last week's weather. It was a little blast of Montana down here in Texas. So I'm happy to talk to you all about monarch butterflies, something you don't see often up in Montana or Utah, as a matter of fact, but we get them here usually just in a couple of weeks. We'll start seeing them. So I'm going to go over monarch biology, this international movement to recover the species, and how you all could get involved into the future. With that, I always like to start with a little introduction. You may be familiar with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a pretty solid presence here in Williamson County and Travis County as well, so hopefully this isn't foreign to you, but we are a federal agency, part of the Department of Interior, and our mission is awesome. It is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. It is with great pride that I take that mission to heart and try to realize that for monarch butterflies and other pollinators, which is something I've been interested in since I was just a young girl growing up in Dallas, actually, so not too far away from here. So why are pollinators important, and what pollinators are out there? I think we're all familiar with the wide variety of different pollinator species that occur, from bees to even some beetles, hummingbirds, butterflies, even some nectar bats. Well, all of these pollinators are vital to our economy. And that is because of their significance in terms of crop production and sustaining our food sources, and then also the part that they play in maintaining environmental health. So in terms of food production, pollinators pollinate about 3/4 of our crops, and the annual value of global crops that are directly affected by pollinators is upwards of $235 billion. That was in a study that was conducted just a few years ago, so pretty recent data there. In addition to that economic value, they're also super important for maintaining our ecosystem services and that environmental health. So they help control our pest populations, they pollinate our wild plants, they enhance our biodiversity, they help stabilize our soils that are the basis for everything. They cleanse our water and air, and of course, they provide food for other wildlife as well. Monarch butterflies are just one type of pollinator, but as I'm going to be focused on them today, I'd like to keep in mind that what's good for monarchs is generally good for that entire suite of pollinators. So we consider them a flagship species, representative of the entire pollinator community. But they are pretty unique in their own right. And the reason for that is because they make this epic round trip migration up to 3,000 miles. This is the longest insect migration in North America, and their breeding area is huge. It's 1,000,000 square kilometers, so it's spread out across much of North America. But you'll see in a little while where they spend their winters is actually confined to a really small area down in Mexico as small as 1.5 acres or so. We've known that monarchs' behavior has been changing for quite a long time, and even back in 1991, scientists classified this migratory route an endangered biological phenomenon for monarchs. And so we've known that their migration route was changing, the numbers were changing year after year, but this really has spurred a lot of science and research to better understand them over the years. Monarchs generally are only found in areas where the temperature is above 55, but below 100 degrees. So they tend to not be able to fly as well when it's below that range, and then they can't withstand those super hot temperatures in the summer months, which is why we don't typically see them here in central Texas during the heat of the summer. Monarchs can live up to 9 months, so they're quite long-lived considering they're only about the weight of a paperclip and rather small. And they move across the landscape with the nectar supply. So where there's blooming flowers, you may be seeing some monarchs. They also catch winds during their migration and can travel up to 30 miles per hour while migrating. So monarchs go through what's called a complete metamorphosis, which just means they have a life cycle that includes 4 stages. What you see on the top left is an egg. That's their first life stage. And they'll be in that egg for about 3 to 7 days or so before the egg hatches, the caterpillar comes out, and then they're in this caterpillar or larval stage for a couple of weeks. Then they enter the pupa or chrysalis stage for another couple of weeks before they emerge as an adult butterfly. This whole cycle takes just a little over a month for the butterfly to complete. And during this time where you're likely to see monarchs is on milkweed plants. So those are the plants that are considered their host plant because that is where they lay their eggs. It is the only food source for monarch caterpillars. And here in Texas, we have 36 or 37 native milkweed species that provide this host plant for monarch butterflies. Also a really good plant for a whole lot of other insects as well. So let's talk a little more about each of those life stages. So as I mentioned, the first thing that happens is the caterpillar will hatch out of this tiny egg casing. And typically you'll find those eggs on the stem of a milkweed plant, underneath a leaf, somewhere around there that the adult monarch has laid that egg, finding a safe spot where she thinks her egg will be protected. And when that caterpillar hatches, it's going to eat its egg casing first and foremost, and then it just becomes an eating machine, mowing down that milkweed as it goes through its caterpillar stage. They actually eat and grow rapidly, growing about 2,000 times their original mass in 10 to 15 days, which is the equivalent of a human infant growing to the size of an adult elephant in just a matter of 2 weeks. So you can imagine there are eating machines. So in that 2-week-long caterpillar stage, the caterpillars go through what's called 5 instars. And the instar is the period between larval molts. So caterpillars actually shed their skin, much like snakes, and when that happens, they enter a new instar. The very first instar caterpillar is going to be really, really small, about the size of your pinky nail. And as you can see with the label here on the slide, it almost looks gray. You can't really see those striping coloration. And it doesn't have tentacles developed yet. And once it sheds its skin and goes into the second instar that you see to the left there, that striping starts to develop. And then it'll go to the third instar that you see in the middle of the screen here. And you can see the tentacles beginning to come about on both the front and the back end, whereas here they were just in the one kind of like little nubs there. But then in the fourth instar, they really start to move around a little more and look more like what you imagine the caterpillar does. And the fifth instar they're quite large, like you see here. And the last thing after that caterpillar is getting ready to turn into the pupa or form its chrysalis, it's going to hang upside down in a J stage. And it'll do this possibly on the milkweed plant, but if it's in like your backyard garden or even a schoolyard garden, somewhere like that, they might crawl away from the milkweed plants and find a safer spot. So sometimes you'll see monarchs doing this underneath a bench in the garden or even under a windowsill, somewhere like that. And so what it's going to do to create this J stage is spin a silk button with a spinneret, which is located just below its mandibles or jaws. And once that button is spun, it's going to flip upside down and hang from its abdomen. And it'll hang in this J shape for 12 to 18 hours. So to better understand monarchs, when I first started studying them, did rear one for scientific purposes in my office, actually, and had this caterpillar eating on milkweed for a couple of weeks. Finally, it's hanging in the J stage. It's been like that for hours and hours. I'm waiting to see what happens next, get on a conference call, and turn around, and I have completely missed the next stage of the process because it happens rather quickly. Like a hurry up and wait situation. But here, it very quickly sheds its skin one last time, and there you have it, a new monarch pupa with that beautiful green coloration with little gold accents there. And when it's green like that, you know that it is fresh chrysalis. That chrysalis will hang and harden in about 24 hours, and it's going to stay like that for 10 to 14 days. The very last thing that happens in that pupa stage is the monarch gets its color, the vein pigmentation and coloration. So after about 2 weeks, you'll end up seeing this orange, black, and white coloration showing through that pupa or chrysalis. And that's how you know a monarch butterfly is getting ready to emerge. It only takes about 30 to 60 seconds for that monarch to open up its casing and head on out, as you can see here. And when the monarch butterfly initially ecloses or emerges, it looks kind of crumpled up there. And it's going to have to hang upside down for a period of time for about 4 to 5 hours and pump its wings back and forth. And when it's doing this, it's actually pumping fluid from its abdomen to its wings and kind of stretching itself out, really, and taking its typical shape that we're used to seeing and that we all recognize as an adult monarch. They're still really fragile for about 24 to 48 hours after they've eclosed as an adult here, but they can fly as soon as their wings harden. So when monarch butterflies are about 4 to 5 days old is when they'll start mating. And as they do that, the females will immediately begin laying eggs afterwards. A single monarch female can lay about 400 to 700 eggs in her lifetime. And this is really typical of insect populations. So you can imagine insects have a very low survival rate. There's tons of different things that can impact them, from other insect predators to the weather to just all kinds of things that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But so very few of those eggs are going to actually survive to adulthood, less than 5% in monarchs. But once the female has laid those eggs will hatch in, we say like 3 to 7 days, but on average 4 is a good estimate there. So there's a trick to identifying the difference between male and female monarchs. And normally I would have told you guys to ask this, but we're in this fun online format here, and I was ill prepared to do so, so my apologies for not making this more interactive. But the way to tell the male and the female apart is that the male has these two pheromone glands that you see on the hind wings on the photo on the left. And those are actually an evolutionary artifact. So in many butterflies, they have these pheromone glands. It emits pheromones, and that's how the male attracts the female mate. In monarchs, that's really not the purpose that they serve, but conveniently for us humans, they do still have the glands, and so it's an easy way to tell the male from the female. The other thing is that the female's wings have a thicker vein pigmentation that you can see in the photo on the right. But really, I think the key characteristic that I look for if I'm trying to figure out if a butterfly is a male or a female is those pheromone glands. So here it's just letting you know that the one on the left is the male and the female is on the right. There are numerous different butterflies that look like monarchs. The photo on the right, all three photos on the right here are monarchs, including the caterpillar photo here, like you saw before. The photos on the left are actually queen butterflies, and many of you have probably seen those in this area as well. They're very common in central Texas. And they also use milkweed plants as their host plants. So it can be very confusing, but the telltale sign of the queen is that they have 3 sets of tentacles on their caterpillars, which you can see in the photo here. They also have a slightly red tint happening, but I think that, once again, the key characteristic is those 3 sets of tentacles as opposed to the 2 on the monarch. And then with the adult butterflies in the photos on the left, you can see that they have additional white around the black vein pigmentation. And when their wings are open, they have a lot less significant vein pigmentation, and it's much easier to tell them apart. But it's something to be cautious of. If you think you see a monarch flying by from afar, it could actually be a queen. Some other butterflies also look like monarchs. We have soldiers here, viceroys are another one that you might see. Sometimes here in Texas, I know the snout butterflies have gone through like huge hatches and people think they're monarchs. They're slightly orange, mostly brown, but some of these butterflies have actually adapted to look like monarchs because monarchs are poisonous to their prey. And that's because the milkweed plants that they rely on when they're in that caterpillar phase actually have cardenaloids. So it's this milky, sappy substance that flows through that milkweed plant. And the caterpillar can ingest it, but it is toxic to other species, including like livestock if they ingested a lot of it, but particularly birds. So if a bird eats a monarch, they're going to likely spit it out because it's not going to taste very well from having eaten that milkweed plant. And that is going to educate that bird to not eat the monarch anymore. So these other butterflies have adapted to look like monarchs to ward off their predators as well. Pretty interesting. Nature is amazing. So the monarchs that we have in North America actually are part of 2 migratory populations. And you can think of those as divided by the Rocky Mountains. So everything on this side of the Rocky Mountains completes a migration to Mexico, and they're part of an eastern migratory population. And everything on the west side of the Rocky Mountains completes a migration from the California coastline in about 400 different sites up into the mountains on the west coast. And that's considered that western migratory population. So we've got 2 migratory populations. You're probably aware that sometimes we see monarchs year-round here in Texas, particularly closer to the Texas coast. We used to consider the Florida population non-migratory because conditions were such that the milkweed plants would bloom there year-round. But that non-migratory population is kind of extended over into Texas. We don't get a ton of them here in the heat of the summer just from our temperatures. that actually cause the milkweed to die back, but sometimes you do see them. However, we've got these two primary migratory populations. And the things that trigger the monarchs to migrate, there's a lot of different philosophies behind why they do what they do, and they vary from, is it a cue from the sun's angle? Is it the day length? Is it the temperature that causes them to head south during the winter? Is it the host plant conditions, so where the milkweeds are in bloom? So different scientists are in different camps about what might be causing their migration. And I just like to enjoy the fact that they do this epic migration, and it's one of the wonders of nature for sure. And I see a couple of chats are coming in the chat, which is great. I should have mentioned earlier on, I think Randy did state this, I've got a couple of breaks in here so that I can take your questions on the different segments of the presentation. So the Western migratory population spends their winters in about 400 different sites on the California coastline. And this is a 620-mile stretch all the way from Mendocino County up in Northern California, all the way down to Baja California. And because they gather in this huge array of areas where they're typically going to be found clustered together in Monterey pine groves or eucalyptus groves, actually, they're in fairly small numbers. So a particular stand of trees might have 500 to 1,000 monarchs that gather together over the entire winter. And because they're spread out in such a large area, there's actually only about 50 sites that generally get monarchs year after year in relatively high quantities. And those are considered the top 50 priority sites for monarch overwintering in the West. But the monarchs that migrate through Texas are part of that eastern migratory population, and in the winter they are down in the states of Michoacan and the state of Mexico, in Mexico. And this area is part of the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, which is designated as a World Heritage Site. There's about 139,000 acres that are protected as part of this reserve. And within this 140,000 acre area, there are individual stands of Oyamel fir trees where the monarchs make their home for the winter. And there's about 19 different stands of these trees that monarchs have been documented in from one year to the next, but they don't always occupy the same stands of trees every single year. It may vary from year to year. So generally they may occur in 7 to 12 of these 19 overall stands within the 140,000 acres. And these are high elevation Oyamel fir forests. So it's not like they're going down to Mexico to spend some time on the beach during the winter months when it's colder here. They're actually going to a fairly cool climate and clustering together, creating this shingle-like environment where they're going through a modified state of hibernation, actually. So what does that look like? Well, these are actually pictures from Catalina Trail, who was the first person to locate the monarch overwintering grounds down in Mexico. She was actually funded by a researcher who really wanted to figure out where were the monarchs going. They knew they were migrating, but could not figure out where. So they put out an ad in the newspaper and were seeking somebody to try to figure it out. And Catalina Trail responded, and she drove around in these high elevation areas for almost 2 years to try to find the monarchs, and talked to locals who I'm sure knew where they were, but it took a long time for her to actually discover these overwintering grounds. And when she did, National Geographic did a feature article, and some of you may have actually seen that. It was, I think, in 1975 or 76 that came out, which was a couple years after she had actually discovered them. But these photos are just amazing those are all those orange butterflies gathered together. They actually gather in such high densities that they create their own microclimate. Just truly amazing. And here is a picture that my coworkers took. So some of the forest in Mexico where these monarchs occur is actually old growth forest. At a loss for words for a moment. That never happens to me. Some of this is old growth forest, and in recent years, there's been a lot of issues in Mexico with loss of this habitat that's so vital to monarchs. But they still have the same behavior in the trees where they do live during the winter, where they're gathering together in those high densities like you see here. So a couple of my coworkers were able to visit the overwintering grounds a few years ago, and I snagged one of their photos just to kind of show you it's still remarkable. And this is just another image to see that they gather in such high densities that you can actually see the forest looks orange from overhead. Also here you can see that some of these areas are void of trees, and in some instances that's from the illegal logging that has occurred, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So let's talk about the annual cycle of monarch butterflies. So in the winter months, as we've talked about, they're down in the states of Michoacan and the state of Mexico, down in Mexico. And they're there typically by mid-November. And they're staying there clustered together on these oyamel fir trees until the springtime. So in March, we know the days start to get a little bit longer, the temperatures start to warm up, and the monarchs start to flutter around, and they begin mating. And they begin flying northward, seeking out milkweed plants upon which to lay their eggs. So we generally will start to see monarchs trickling into Texas as early as mid-March. I think last year it was like the first week of March that I saw my first monarch, which was remarkably early. But generally a little later in March and into April, we'll start seeing those tattered monarchs that have lived all these months down at the wintering grounds. And those monarchs will lay their eggs on our milkweed plants, and then they'll die off. And the eggs that they have laid will go through the complete life cycle that I explained earlier. And when they emerge as an adult butterfly, that's generally going to happen by early May. And that's that first generation. So they're the children, so to speak, of the overwintering generation. And those children are going to do the same thing. They're going to begin mating, they're going to lay their eggs, and they're going to seek out milkweed plants, which by late May and early June, typically are not in great shape here in Texas because our temperatures are starting to get hot. So they're flying northward up into Oklahoma, maybe Louisiana, maybe even a little bit further north, and laying their eggs on those milkweed plants. And then those children are dying off, and their children are going to do the same thing. And so this actually happens 4 to 5 times over the course of the summer months. And that's why we don't generally see the monarchs in the heat of the summer here. But we will start seeing them again in the August-September timeframe when things are dying back up north as it's getting a little colder. And as that occurs, the monarchs are going to come through Texas on their way back down into Mexico. Our peak in the Williamson County area is typically the second week of October. So that's when we're seeing loads and loads of monarchs migrating through as they're on their way down to Mexico. And when they're doing that in the fall, it is really important that we have blooming nectar plants for these monarchs to feed off of, because they need to create this lipid reserve and essentially fatten up to withstand that, to make it through the full migration and then also live over the course of those winter months. So I should mention that in the summer, monarchs only live about 2 to 5 weeks, as opposed to those that make the migration down to Mexico and come back, they live 6 to 9 months, generally speaking. And this is just a different way to show that migratory route. So here they're overwintering grounds down in Mexico. That first generation is created here in Central Texas in the early spring. The second, third, and fourth generations are typically in the more northern part of the US, in the Corn Belt generally, and even up into Canada. And then they fly southward. And sometimes they do reproduce again on that southward journey, but that's occurred more frequently in recent years. But they also are just passing through on their way to Mexico as well. So how high do they fly on their migration? Well, they've been documented flying as high as 11,000 feet. A group of monarchs is actually called a kaleidoscope, and if you are ever lucky enough to see a kaleidoscope, I think that is an amazing sight. They've been documented out of the 54th window of the Renaissance Tower in Dallas, and I just love the mental image of someone working at their computer in their office and looking out the window and seeing all of these monarchs, which did happen to me in the fall of 2019 in North Austin, actually. But they've also been documented from hot air balloonists as well. So even though they seem very fragile and only weigh as much as a paperclip, they do fly really high, and they're able to kind of ride the jet stream. So they're not like flapping their wings this whole migratory route. They're actually able to catch the wind and travel rather quickly. And monarch habitat, because monarchs are opportunistic and they're really just looking for milkweed upon which to lay their eggs so that their caterpillars have the food they need to eat. And then also the nectar plants. So that's what's going to fuel the adult monarchs. And anywhere that has milkweed and nectar is going to be monarch habitat. And that means we can make monarch habitat anywhere from rooftops to your backyard, to ranch land, to farmland, along the edges of farmland, along roadways. So really unique opportunity rather than some of the other species that my agency works on. That have more specific habitat requirements that are a little harder to create. But for monarchs, we're really lucky that it's easy to replicate the type of habitat that they really need. So with that, I know there's a few questions in the chat, and I'm happy to take those before we move into this next section.
So would you like me to read those off to you, Katie?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Okay. So Julie would like to know, does the female lay eggs only once or throughout its life?
So throughout her life, she will, but in the summer months, that's only like 2 to 5 weeks. But over the course of her life, it'll be 400 to 700 eggs.
A lot of eggs.
Yeah.
And Kate would like to know, where are some places in Texas that we would likely see them hatch or migrate in large numbers?
You know, that is a great question, and it completely varies year to year. So it's hard to point you in the direction of anywhere in particular. But I think it's generally, we do see them in higher concentrations in South Texas. And in part, that's because there's not as abundant milkweed. Here in Central Texas, there's actually quite a bit of native milkweed out there. And you can go and look at all of it and look for eggs, and you might find one or two, you might find none, but it's rare that you find them clustered together. So I think it might be a strategy possibly of the female to lay her eggs across a wide variety of milkweeds because they're more likely, it might increase the success of them surviving to adulthood. So unfortunately, not a great answer to your question.
Yeah, it sounds like they're very opportunistic, so it's kind of hard. It's kind of like and I'm at a loss for words now as well, but there's a couple of other migrating deals come through that you never know where they're going to be.
Yeah.
Richard had a comment there about there's a lot of illegal logging going on in Mexico, and no forest is safe there. But he was wondering, are you aware of the geolocation data from the golden chief warbler that they've been collecting, and whether some of those wintering grounds in Mexico will be included along with the monarch?
That is a great question. Funny enough, I'm actually about to be working on the golden chief warbler. So I am not aware of that yet. I'm brand new to working on golden cheek warblers, but that's something that I'm starting to work on actually next month. So timely question, and I will definitely check that out.
Cool. And Leona would know what kind of plant is that they like to gather on there. I guess back when you were doing the California.
So in California, they're on where they spend their winters is along eucalyptus and Monterey pine trees, as opposed to down in Mexico, they're on Oyamel fir forests. But then during the year when they're breeding, they're on milkweed plants.
And then that's a great lead in because Ashley came back right with that and said, why do the California monarchs use the eucalyptus trees if those are not native to California? Did the monarchs there always have a western migration before the eucalyptus were planted?
Yeah, so we do think they did, and I think the Monterey pine is probably the more prime habitat for monarchs, but it's a clear illustration of how adaptable they really are and how opportunistic they are. So while I wish there was more of the natives there for them, it's pretty interesting that they've been able to cluster together in the eucalyptus and non-natives there. Mm-hmm.
Nice. And then Valerie would like to know, are the eastern and western populations genetically different, or are they considered one species or different subspecies?
They are considered one species, and they do have slightly different genetics, but there is admixing of the two populations that occurs along the Rocky Mountains, essentially. So like New Mexico, Colorado, they don't get a ton of monarchs, but sometimes they are able to cross over between the two different populations. In Arizona, parts of northern Mexico, I'm sure, are important for this as well. So they are genetically the same species. So there's not enough difference to be a subspecies.
Okay, and then somebody, Amanda, mentioned that she had seen thousands on the willow trees in the Wichita Fall areas in the beginning of October 2018.
Yeah, so that would be probably roosting behavior. So sometimes when they're migrating, they actually do gather together on available trees like that. And that really is something you really only see in Texas, and maybe Oklahoma as well. Sometimes Kansas in a fluke year, but I've heard people down by like the Devil's River have actually seen monarchs clustered together in densities. And it's just for 1 or 2 nights. To escape cold weather or whatever it might be on their way down.
And speaking of that, Brent wanted to know, how would this recent polar vortex affect the flowers and the migration?
I mean, I haven't seen a lot. I haven't seen any of the native species starting to come out of the ground just yet. All the native milkweeds anyway, typically die back, and they don't start coming out until early March. Generally speaking, not always. So I don't know that there will be a huge effect from this, but I know there were a ton of blooming flowers around my neighborhood, and they were completely encased in ice, and now they're dead. But hopefully, this is happening a little earlier than would hurt the monarchs. That's what I'm hoping.
Great, that'd be nice. Like some of our other species here, locally suffered through the cold. Found that, let's see, they found
caterpillars. I see this one as well.
Queens, yeah, monarchs and queens in the eastern part in the Tiger Rusk area, all on antelope milkweed. But there's lots of other milkweeds that they use. Do they use all equally, or?
They don't use it all equally. So there's 36 or 37 different native milkweed species in Texas, and each different species of milkweed has a different concentration of those toxic cardinaloids that I mentioned before. So it seems like they're more inclined to lay their eggs on the milkweed plants that have higher levels of cardinaloids. And unfortunately, a lot of people plant tropical milkweed, which have really high concentrations of cardinaloids, and that's not a native species, but they do end up getting a lot of eggs on it, and it's partially because of these cardinaloids concentrations, whereas antelope horn is a little more moderate. Our native zozotes or side cluster milkweed, which is more common a little bit further south of here, but also in here. That tends to be a better one that you'll find more eggs on. Antelope horn, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And then like we have butterfly weed as well as another one that's fairly common here. And that's a really low cardinaloid concentration. So it's a great nectar source for them, but you won't see eggs on them very often. Great questions.
Nice. Well, that's all that we have right now. So we'll let you get on with the presentation.
Sounds good. There we go. Okay, so great that you asked about if they're the same species. So actually, the same species of monarch occurs in 90 countries across the globe. And there really aren't reliable records of monarchs in all of these other countries outside of North America and the Caribbean prior to 1840. So it's generally accepted that these monarchs are showing up in all of these other countries because they were dispersed there from human assistance. So maybe cargo containers that had milkweed plants that had caterpillars on them, or extreme weather events might have blown them to parts of their range where they haven't been previously, so on and so forth. But they do occur in 90 different countries. The eastern and western North American populations are the only migratory populations. So they're very unique in that regard. And although they are in 90 countries, what you're seeing here is the proportion that are within the populations worldwide. And I think it's important to note that in Eastern North America, where we are, where our monarchs are part of this population, that is the vast majority of the global population of monarchs. The West is that really tiny purple sliver that you see there. And then the only other area that we have like any data on how many monarchs there are is in Australia. And based on scientists in Australia who we've communicated with, they think there's about 1.4 million monarchs that occur there. So just to give you a sense of where they occur. And then outside of Australia and North America, it's estimated that maybe there's around 4 million in all of these other countries, but the vast majority are in North America. So why are we talking about monarchs? Well, monarchs have declined dramatically over the last 20 or so years. This graph is showing the monarch population, or the area that the monarchs occupy at their overwintering grounds down in Mexico. So since they're all clustered together during those winter months, the scientists are able to measure the area of the trees that they occupy, estimate the density, and calculate out the number of monarchs they think that occur there. So in 1996 to 1997, there were about 45 acres occupied, and that was a good year. But still, it's remarkable to think of the millions of monarchs clustered together in an area that's only 45 acres. And then in 2013 to 2014, they dropped down to 1.65 acres at their overwintering grounds. And so that huge population decline was really the nexus to get people to pay attention and to start this international movement to try to bring back the monarchs. In recent years, we've seen a little bit of an uptick. So 2018 to 2019, there were about 15 acres occupied. That was great news. That was also a really wet year. So we had great last year there was about 2.8 hectares. Right before I joined this meeting, I got an email that the wintering numbers for this year came out earlier today. So this is in the news right now. And they have dropped 26% from last year. There's about 2 hectares that are occupied this winter. So hot off the press. Our goal is to try to get them to occupy period on, like, average that for a 10-year period. So that's what this line across the graph is showing. That's what we think is the historical average of their abundance. So that's where we'd like to get them. We're happy we got them there 1 year, but we've got a long ways to go to get that 10-year average at that mark. The western monarch population has declined also very dramatically. Also here, because they gather in a wider area and in smaller densities, volunteers actually go out and count the monarchs on the trees. So it's a huge citizen science effort to do this. And back in 1997, there were about 1.2 million monarchs. So they count the individuals, so we have monarch numbers here as opposed to that area. So in 97, 1.2 million monarchs. In 2018 and 2019, there were only about 30,000. And we've been very concerned. What's going on? Why have they dropped down to such a low number? This last winter, it was announced that there were only 1,914 monarchs in this western population. So all that area on the California coastline, tiny, tiny number of monarchs occupying that. Really unfortunate, and I think our focus is pretty well shifting to try to figure out what can we do, because it is a dire situation. So what's causing the decline? I've already mentioned illegal logging is a huge problem. These are aerial images of the overwintering grounds down in Mexico, and you can see the logging that has occurred there. Because the monarchs are in those high densities at their overwintering grounds, they're really susceptible to any kind of event that might impact them there. So a few years ago, there was a fluke March snowstorm at their overwintering grounds, and all the monarchs were still there, and it killed off large numbers of monarchs. And so as climate change happens and we have more extreme weather events, this is a problem for monarchs, in addition to the human-caused illegal logging. Throughout the rest of the species range, we've gone through a dramatic habitat loss. So native grasslands are actually called the least conserved and most altered landscapes on Earth by the Nature Conservancy. And we're losing loads of acres every day to development. So that is impacting where the monarchs have these native flower resources that they really need. In addition, the conversion of native prairie to cropland has, of course, declined habitat for them as well. And then another large problem for monarchs is thought to be the introduction of herbicide-tolerant plants. So in 2008, almost 100% of the monarchs came from milkweed that occurred in agricultural fields. And prior to that, there were probably large amounts that came from farmland. So if you remember, the generations 2, 3, and 4 during the heat of the summer are created up in the corn belt primarily. And that's when they're farming corn. And so in the 90s and early 2000s, these farmlands started using genetically modified corn, Roundup Ready corn. These seeds are modified so that they can tolerate treatments of herbicide, but the herbicide will kill all of the other plants. So milkweed used to pop up in between row crops and on edges. It has a huge tuberous root system. It could handle the tilling, and it would pop up. Monarchs would lay their eggs there, and so on and so forth. But with the introduction of this genetically modified corn and soybeans in the corn belt, the milkweed cannot withstand those herbicide treatments, and we've lost a huge amount of the milkweed plants that are critical to monarchs. It's actually estimated that 1.3 billion milkweed plants have been lost to soy, corn, and development. Other factors that are causing impacts to monarchs are things like insecticides, climate change, of course, that's shifting where their habitat occurs, and then the plants they require are in bloom, invasive species, predation, and parasites as well. So all of these different things are impacting the population and causing the decline that we've seen in the last 20 years. But all is not lost. So on the heels of that very low population count in 2013 to 2014, there was this North American Leaders Summit. And the president of the US, president of Mexico, and the prime minister of Canada, they all gathered together, and of all things they could be talking about, they started talking about monarchs as a symbol of international cooperation between these three countries, and also recognizing monarchs are a pollinator vital to the economy, and if we lose them, we're going to lose a lot of other pollinators as well, most likely. It's indicating some poor health of our ecosystem, and that's going to hurt us across the board. So they wanted to work together to conserve the monarch. And shortly thereafter, the White House released this presidential memo on pollinators back in June of 2014. And that was like a huge moment. I know plenty of scientists have dedicated their entire careers to pollinator conservation, but it's never really been prime time cover of the news until this happened. And shortly thereafter, the Federal Pollinator Health Strategy was released. That's what we call this document in May of 2015. And this document, released by the White House, really laid out specific goals that we, across all federal agencies, needed to work towards to benefit pollinators. Those goals were to reduce honeybee winter colony losses to 15%. They were at 30% at the time. And then to increase the eastern monarch population. And that's where that goal of having them occupy about 15 acres at their overwintering grounds came from. So this document said we need to increase that population and get them to occupy 6 hectares or 15 acres by 2020. We did for 1 year, but we need to do it now for about a 10-year average. And then the third goal from this document was to restore or enhance 7 million acres over 5 years. And we've been working towards all of those since about 2015 when I first started working on monarchs. And how are we doing this? So we're improving habitat. You can't have monarchs if you don't have their habitat. We are trying to propagate native seeds. You are probably aware that it can be hard to find native seed sources that are ecoregional appropriate. So we're trying to increase those seeds. We are also doing research and monitoring and launching citizen science programs as well. And then community and engagement and in partnerships. So working with others, which is fundamental to trying to protect any kind of species. You may have heard back in December that the Fish and Wildlife Service was also trying to determine whether the monarch is an endangered species. And that's because we received a petition to list the monarch as a threatened species back in 2014. And that initiated a regulatory process. I'm not really going to focus on that, but that happened in August of 2014, and in December of that year, we released what's called a positive 90-day finding that said the petitioned action may be warranted. So it launched a status review. Basically, we had to create a team, look at what's the current condition of the monarch, what's affecting the monarch, what does the future look like for the monarch, and we did that and released a species status assessment in December and released what's called a 12-month finding. And that just happened December 15, 2020. In that finding, we had the option to have 3 different outcomes. So the species might be warranted for listing, and if so, we propose it as threatened or endangered. And that launches a public comment period, and we consider those public comments. The second option is that the listing is not warranted, and the process would be complete, and it would not be proposed for listing. And then the third option is that listing the species is warranted but precluded. And that just means there's higher priority listing actions. So that last option is what we announced in December of last year. And we have 160 different species that are awaiting decision of whether or not they're endangered or threatened. And they're considered a higher priority based on a variety of factors like the magnitude of the threats that they're facing, the fact that the monarch has so much conservation efforts going on is part of the decision process as well. And so essentially the service has announced if the monarch still warrants listing as threatened or endangered in 2024, we will go ahead and propose that listing. And between now and then, we're gonna continue conservation efforts, continue to work with our partners, continue to educate people about the monarch, and try to change the trajectory for them and give some time for all the conservation to get on the ground. So, does anybody have any questions about that before I jump into more about how you can get engaged? Hopefully I'm not boring you all to death, but seeing none, I'm going to carry on. Okay, so habitat enhancement and improvements. Well, given the decline of the monarch, the state fish and wildlife agencies across the entire Midwest of the United States gathered together and created this Mid-America Monarch Conservation Strategy. And this is saying that in those purple states, they're going to work together to try to create a 1.3 billion additional milkweed stems over 20 years. Amazing and very ambitious goal. Highly focused on milkweed, because if you recall, I told you that the Corn Belt is where the monarchs occur in the middle of the summer, and that area has seen dramatic loss in milkweed. But here in the South Core, it's not as focused on milkweed. We have milkweed out there, but we don't often see eggs in high densities. And so down here, our focus is really on milkweed and nectar. We really just want healthy grasslands down here. So our state fish and wildlife agency, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, that's what they're working towards. Healthy grasslands to serve as habitat for monarchs. Recently, there was a study that came out, and it basically said, if we look at 5 different sectors of habitat, is there any way we can achieve the goal of 1.6 billion milkweeds by just focusing on one sector? So the sectors they looked at were marginal ag lands, so like along the edges of crop fields, urban and suburban spaces, protected grasslands, the Conservation Reserve Program, so that's former farmland that has been put into prairie, and then rights of way along roads, along pipelines, so on and so forth. So they were looking at how much habitat do we need to create in each of these areas to get to 1.6 billion milkweeds. And ultimately what they found is there's no way to achieve that goal unless you focus on all 5. So we need an all hands on deck approach to conserving monarch habitat. We can't just pick protected grasslands. We've got to focus on everything across the board. Additionally, monarchs are actually an umbrella species for grassland birds, which is important throughout Texas in particular. So the green area here is just showing you monarch habitat on that x-axis on the bottom. So they occur in these native warm season grasses, shrub habitat, and even sometimes in that second growth pine oak. And within that same habitat type, you might also find yellow-breasted chat, prairie warbler, the northern bobwhite quail, which is very popular, the eastern meadowlark, so on and so forth. And so if we create habitat for monarchs, we're going to benefit all of these grassland birds as well. And if we create habitat for them, we're likely also going to benefit monarchs. So there's a lot of overlap, which is great when we're talking to landowners to try to create or enhance habitat for them. Speaking of landowners, there's all kinds of different programs to offer financial and technical assistance to landowners. So we have habitat improvement projects where if you have ranch land, you might be able to get scientific help from a private land biologist, and you also might be able to get some funding support to do things like brush management, removal of invasive species, reseeding with native species, which is critical, fire, even prescribed fire on your land. So those types of things that are going to benefit. And that's because we've lost so many grasslands to habitat just like this. And milkweed plants need that sunshine, and they can't get it when they're shaded out by these woody species that have invaded into their habitat. But there are programs for landowners from all these different entities that can help. There's also a large program here called the Pastures for Upland Birds program, and essentially they work to restore pastures that are typically dominated by exotic grasses, and this is a fairly common scene in Texas. And they provide cost share incentives to landowners to restore that habitat to native grasses and forbs. So this habitat isn't going to be great for monarchs or any of your grassland birds, but if we can create something more like this, you might start to see monarchs back. You've got benefits for all these different species. Quail, it's even good for your deer and livestock as well. It's great to have that diversity and have a healthy ecosystem. We also are working with schools to create habitat. So using these kind of vacant lots and unused spaces to create habitat for monarchs, but also outdoor classrooms that are going to benefit the students and give them more hands-on experience. And for me, that's really important because I know I'm not going to be in this job forever. Eventually, I know long time, I have a long time. I will retire someday, and I want to make sure that there's somebody to pick up where I've left off. So I think these outdoor classrooms are a very important piece of the puzzle to making sure we're creating that next generation of conservationists. And kids love monarchs, so it's a great opportunity.
Good.
I almost jumped at the dog barking there. So seed propagation is another piece of the puzzle. I've already kind of mentioned that. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has great resources posted on their website through a project called Project Milkweed, essentially encouraging folks to collect milkweed seeds in the seed pods that you see on the bottom here, and creating like a seed repository, and then also figuring out the best way to propagate those seeds and germinate them. So trying to boost that native milkweed supply and get the costs down, as well as trying to boost the supply of native nectar plants as well. And then research and monitoring is hugely important. Monarchs are monitored at every single life stage. So as a master naturalist group, you might be interested in getting involved in some of the citizen science behind monarchs. The list of programs here is just the ones that we know off the top of our head. There is a lot of monitoring of monarchs. So I'll talk about a couple of those here in just a second. We also are into the community engagement and partnerships. So with that, we're trying to work with our state agencies, other federal agencies like the Forest Service, and the Department of Agriculture, also tribes, nonprofits, companies and corporations, schools, citizen scientists, and landowners. So looking all across the board. Former First Lady Laura Bush founded her nonprofit organization, Texan by Nature, and they've been promoting monarch conservation as well. And this photo is from a press event that she did here in Austin, down at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center a couple years ago, which is pretty awesome. So I'm going to cruise through some of our success stories. One is the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. over 700 different cities across the US, Mexico, and Canada have taken the Mayor's Monarch Pledge. And that basically means their municipality has committed to actions to benefit the monarchs. And the categories of those actions are things like communications, demonstration gardens, so using things like City Hall as monarch habitat, and then also systems change. So sometimes milkweed is on the list of noxious species for a particular area, and so through this effort, we are tackling that issue to try to make sure that, you know, native milkweed is actually a really beneficial and critical plant. So let's keep it out there. But this program is led by the National Wildlife Federation, and it has been amazing, especially throughout Texas, where they've established these monarch networks and hosted a lot of different trainings. In Oklahoma, I've also had the pleasure of working on the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, and this is a tribal-led organization that's joining 30 different tribes across the state. There's 39 federally recognized tribes up in Oklahoma, and they're working together to try to create habitat for monarchs and other pollinators, and then also try to propagate culturally important plants as well as a part of this puzzle. So they teach classes to tribes and tribal staff and volunteers on how to have resources to do this work, and then also how to actually conduct this work and restore habitat. Pretty amazing. We're also focused on the ground conservation, of course. Our agency does work with private landowners through what's called the Partners Program. We've also worked with international partners and with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Collectively, our agency has enhanced 1.4 million acres across the entire United States, and that's through our lands and then also through working with private landowners and partners. Amazing. Here in Texas, between 2014 and 2019, our Partners Program enhanced 34,500 acres across the state, using about $1.35 million in that time frame. Those are the completed projects during those 5 years. Still have more to go. We're still working on this now and want to see these numbers increase moving forward. Across the entire country, we collected data on how much is going on and found that there's 48,812 conservation efforts that were entered into this database called the Monarch Conservation Database. And those conservation efforts were either completed, ongoing, or planned on 5.6 million acres across the country. Pretty cool to see. The areas that are in red are the highest number of efforts. Orange is the second highest. Yellow is the third. So if you look at Texas, we got a lot of yellow and orange in here, which means we have a lot going on for monarch conservation. Across the entire country, it's estimated that all of these conservation efforts have created 491 million stems of milkweed. There's also a rights of way as habitat working group, and they're working with folks like Texas Department of Transportation and energy companies to try to voluntarily incorporate monarch conservation into what they do. Through what's called a candidate conservation agreement with assurances, the policy document, they have a commitment from over 40 partners across the U.S. to restore 665,000 acres of habitat for the species. So that means they're going to voluntarily manage those lands to benefit the monarch and other pollinators. It's pretty amazing, primarily for energy and transmission companies and then the State Department of Transportation. Here in Texas, it's the DOT, and then also Northern Natural Gas has signed on to this. So any questions? I know there's a few in the chat here.
Yes, we do have a few. So, uh, Gail would like to know what top milkweed would you recommend to plant here in the Georgetown, Texas area? And Billy would also kind of along the same line. Would you repeat the milkweed species the monarchs prefer to lay their eggs on, or is there somewhere that people can go to get that?
Yeah, so I would suggest the Zizotes milkweed. I wonder if I can type this in here. If you guys, will they be able to see it if I type it in the chat, maybe?
If you type it into the chat window, they will be able to see it.
All right, I'm gonna see if I can figure that out. Chat. Okay. Because I think a lot of people aren't used to seeing this word. Zozotes or side cluster milkweed is one that's really good, and it is a native species. I mean, the antelope corn is also good, and the green antelope corn. Yeah, so those are the three generally best that I see here. So I would recommend any of those three. It's harder to find them. Like you might need to go venture down to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center when they have their native plant sale. I'm not sure how they're doing that amidst COVID times, but or talk to your Native Plant Society chapter in Georgetown and see if you can find folks who have good sources of native milkweed. But those are
Okay.
the species that I recommend.
Thanks. That was going to be my next question is where can they pick those up? But that may be a little harder to find. Brett would like to know, are there any other butterflies that are in as much danger as the monarch?
So there are in other parts of the country, but not here. So there's a couple that we are also going to be evaluating for whether they are endangered. There's a fritillary on there and the frosted elfin. Those are the ones that we're looking at right now, but none that have documented declines to the level as monarchs in our part of the country. And then, yeah, anything.
Sorry, I had a problem getting my video to work again. So John was wondering if there's maybe any connection to. We had Douglas Tallamy here with to speak to the Texas Master Naturalists there on their Tuesday this month, and he talked about a thing called the Homegrown National Park, and basically it was kind of what you talked about, where you do things around your local. Your lawns and your personal spaces or your green areas in your neighborhoods to make them better habitats for these animals that are having some problems.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that, but I feel like I think that Doug helped develop this native plant finder database that National Wildlife Federation has created, which is a really good resource if you're looking for how to garden. I do think it's a great idea, kind of acting locally, and it's something that's going to benefit not just monarchs, but the whole suite of pollinators and our birds. Their habitat is just going away. So stuff like that is going to be critical into the future.
And then Mary Ann was wondering if you had any comment on people who are raising monarchs and releasing them to increase the number that survive into adulthood.
Yeah, so there's a lot of mixed science behind that, and there has been a recent study that suggests that monarchs that are reared in conditions that are not, natural or outdoor, what they would experience in the wild, are losing their migratory capacity and not necessarily migrating to their overwintering grounds. So generally speaking, I recommend that we don't take them inside and rear them. I know that can be hard to do. I do think for educational purposes, it is not a problem to rear some with kids, or if you're even just educating your chapter, for example, just doing it once or twice to better understand the biology of the species. But across the board, we're not convinced that that's going to be beneficial to the population.
And then we had a couple comments, like our local chapter of NetPlot is going to be having a sale here March 26th and 27th from 9 to 5 at Berry Springs, but they're not quite sure how much milkweed is available there. We also had another member of our chapter comment, Joel, that he's got a ton of the zyzote milkweed in his yard, naturally occurring, and he's going to harvest the seeds this summer and share them with the chapter for everybody that's in.
Awesome, love that.
And then Michelle was wondering, they've seen lots of large milkweed bugs, the red and black bugs, they said, on the milkweed. Are those good or bad for the monarchs?
So they generally don't impact the monarchs, is my understanding, but they may be not great for the milkweed plants themselves. So we don't pick them off or anything, but they're just a part of the kind of naturally occurring associate with the plant, with the milkweed plants, and we leave them. But aphids generally are a big problem on milkweed plants and for monarchs, and so those can be a pain in the butt if you get them on your milkweed, which is almost inevitable. So I think there's some natural methods to try to get rid of aphids. It can be hard though.
All right, well, that's all the questions I'm seeing at this time. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I was happy to have you this evening, and thanks everybody for joining us. And if there are no more questions, I guess we'll call a meeting. All right.
Well, thank you everybody so much for your time and attention. You guys have been a great audience, and if you want to contact me, I invite you to do so as well.
Great. I'll if you don't mind, I will pass the your email out to the chapter in case they've got any other questions. And we've got a couple. Thank you so much for coming in as well. So thanks again, and good night, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.